In a quiet, dimly lit courtroom, the air felt thick with anticipation as the white judge sat sternly at his bench, looking down over the room with the seasoned confidence of someone who's seen every type of defendant come and go. Today was just another case, another name in a long line of files stacked on his desk. But this one seemed different, though he couldn't quite place why. His gaze fell upon the woman standing before him, a calm yet unshakable presence. She was poised, her gaze steady, and her confidence unwavering, though she gave nothing away. With an air of self-assurance, she didn't appear rattled in the slightest, though most in her position would have been. The woman, a black professional dressed impeccably in a dark suit, held a certain grace and resilience that set her apart. Her stance and demeanor showed not a trace of fear or intimidation. She knew where she was, and she knew exactly how to carry herself in this space. The people in the gallery observed her, perhaps trying to make sense of why someone like her was standing in this courtroom, waiting to be judged. But appearances can be deceiving, and none in the room knew the weight this woman carried beneath her calm exterior. As the judge sifted through the case details, his demeanor remained unmoved, a picture of authority and conviction. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was more than what she seemed. She wasn't just another citizen caught up in the system. In fact, the system was her domain, a realm she understood inside and out. For she was, unbeknownst to the judge, a federal prosecutor, someone who spent her days upholding the very laws that now hung over her. But she remained silent, letting the proceedings play out, watching the judge carefully as he prepared to deliver his verdict. The room was tense with unspoken emotions as he finally leaned forward, announcing her fine with a voice echoing through the courtroom, unyielding in its authority. She accepted his words with the faintest nod, though her gaze never wavered. The judge, believing his ruling was absolute, had no inkling of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface of her calm expression. What he was yet to discover would shake the very foundation of his assumptions, both about her and the justice he thought he was serving. The judge's gavel hit the block, its echo reverberating throughout the silent courtroom. He sat back, believing that his work here was done, that he had exercised justice and held firm to the law. But across from him, the woman didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, watching him carefully, almost studying him. Her silence wasn't submission. It was patience, as though she were waiting for something. Her expression was unreadable, neither defiant nor resigned, but there was a strength there that was hard to miss. The courtroom attendees murmured in whispers, curious, maybe even a little bewildered by her reaction, or lack thereof. The judge shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He wasn't accustomed to defendants, especially those facing fines, looking back at him with such composure. He cleared his throat, brushing off the unsettled feeling that crept over him, and glanced at the case file again, as if hoping something he'd missed would explain her calm. The woman hadn't yet revealed her identity, and no one had asked. In truth, it was not uncommon for people in court to keep to themselves, but there was a part of her that had wanted to clarify her position right then and there. She could have introduced herself as a federal prosecutor, declared her role in the justice system, and let the judge realize the irony of his ruling. But she decided against it, allowing him to carry on as though she were just another defendant, a face without a story. There was a purpose in her silence, though only she knew it. The room's stillness only heightened the quiet tension between them. She understood more about this courtroom than anyone realized. The walls, the worn wooden benches, the procedural patterns of justice, all were familiar to her. In countless cases, she had been the one to bring defendants to stand where she now stood, always trusting in the fairness of the legal process. But today, things felt different. She was on the other side, witnessing the justice system from a place she never expected, and it made her see things she hadn't noticed before. The judge, despite his authority, seemed almost oblivious to the woman's standing. He was focused solely on the facts in front of him. A minor infraction, a small fine. He barely looked up, assuming, perhaps, that her story wasn't important, that her background wasn't relevant. The gavel's authority was, in his mind, enough to define her place in this setting. But that assumption, that small oversight, was a crack in the seemingly unbreakable walls of his judgment, a crack that might soon widen. As the minutes ticked by, the scene became less about the ruling and more about the strange tension in the room. To the judge, she was merely someone caught up in the minor wheels of justice, another name and another case that he would likely forget by the end of the day. Yet the woman felt the weight of every second, each heartbeat a reminder of the countless people who had stood here before, people she had once been tasked with prosecuting, people she had never fully understood until this very moment. She wondered if the judge, who seemed so assured in his authority, could sense the subtle irony of the situation. Did he realize that she was, in many ways, his peer, that they were part of the same world? But his detached demeanor suggested otherwise. She wasn't angry. She didn't harbor resentment. She simply observed, quietly noting the power dynamics and the unspoken assumptions at play. And as she stood there, another memory surfaced, unbidden but clear as day. She recalled a similar courtroom years ago when she had first argued a case as a prosecutor. She had been nervous, trying hard to control her nerves, to present herself as competent, fair, and worthy of the position she held. Back then, she had believed in the absoluteness of the law, in the idea that justice was blind to color, background, or position. She believed in her role as a protector of that justice. But today, she was starting to see the gray, the subtleties that weren't as apparent from the bench, but were undeniable when standing in the defendant's shoes. The room remained quiet, the judge busy signing documents, moving on from the case, already seemingly dismissing it from his mind. But then, as if some part of her instinct couldn't let it rest, she cleared her throat, drawing his attention back to her. He looked up, slightly annoyed but masking it well. His brows raised as if to say, "Asterisk, is there something else?" Asterisk, she wanted to say something, to reveal her identity, to challenge him on his assumptions, but she held back, choosing her words carefully. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said finally, her voice calm and steady. "I appreciate the clarity of your ruling." The words were polite, even deferential, yet there was something in her tone that hinted at the layers beneath. She saw his eyebrows knit together, a slight flicker of curiosity in his eyes. It was as though he realized at that moment that there was something more to her, something he hadn't considered. But he couldn't put his finger on it, and she wasn't about to make it easy for him. Outside the courtroom, she exhaled, feeling the weight of her thoughts settle upon her. She had been through this process before, with others in her role as a prosecutor, yet never imagined it would feel so different when the tables were turned. For a moment, she questioned the very system she had spent her career upholding. Was it really as just and fair as she had always believed, or was there something flawed, something overlooked in the way it handled people? She knew the answer, but she wasn't ready to face it just yet. Instead, she walked down the courthouse steps, her mind replaying the judge's expression, the look of confidence in his eyes, the certainty of his ruling. She wondered if he would remember her face, if he would even recognize her the next time their paths crossed, which she suspected might happen sooner than he realized. She allowed herself a slight smile, knowing she had left a part of her story untold, left him with a puzzle that he might not solve until their roles were reversed once again. For now, she would return to her life, her work, the responsibilities that called her back to the other side of the courtroom. But this experience would stay with her, a reminder of the unseen biases and quiet power plays that shaped the world of justice. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger, something that would push her to look beyond the surface, to see the people behind the cases, to remember that justice was, at its heart, about humanity. As she reached the sidewalk, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague, pulling her back to the reality of her world, her duties as a prosecutor. She hesitated, glancing back at the courthouse, its towering structure casting a long shadow over her. She knew she would return, perhaps with a new perspective, perhaps with something to say. But for now she left, leaving the judge to carry on with his day, unaware of the lesson he had just unknowingly imparted. And though he didn't know it yet, their paths would cross again. The woman, whose name was Maya Henderson, returned to her life as a federal prosecutor, though something within her had shifted after that day in court. Each morning, as she walked through the courthouse doors, she felt a strange weight, like the memory of that encounter with the judge lingered, quietly asking questions she couldn't ignore. She had spent years in courtrooms, enforcing the law, ensuring justice, yet now she found herself seeing things with a different lens. The judge from her case, Judge Albright, was a fixture in the courthouse, a man known for his sharp mind and unwavering commitment to the law. To his colleagues and the public, he was a symbol of justice. But for Maya, his face now symbolized something more complex. His ruling had been impartial, yes, but his assumptions, the way he had looked at her, revealed biases that made her wonder. She had glimpsed a version of the system she'd been blind to, a version that wasn't entirely fair, that didn't always see people as they were. But Maya kept this revelation close, silently navigating her cases with a newfound awareness. She couldn't quite shake the thought that Judge Albright might have treated her differently if he'd known who she was from the beginning. And the fact that he hadn't, that he'd seen her as just another defendant without even considering her story, began to gnaw at her. It was as though her own role in the system had been turned against her, making her question how many others might have stood before her with stories untold, lives misunderstood. Her colleagues began to notice her change in demeanor. She was still diligent, still as driven as ever, but there was a softness to her that wasn't there before, an empathy that went beyond her usual professionalism. She listened more closely to her defendants, looked deeper into their lives, and started to wonder how many had been seen only for their worst moments, rather than the complexity of who they truly were. But she wasn't about to voice these thoughts. She feared they might undermine her authority, her hard-earned reputation. So she carried on, keeping these reflections to herself, quietly changing the way she approached each case. Meanwhile, Judge Albright, oblivious to the impact he'd had, continued his work. In his world, nothing was out of the ordinary. He was unaware of Maya's true identity, unaware that she walked the same halls as he did, handling cases that often came before him. He remained deeply rooted in his ways, focused on efficiency and order, believing he was doing right by the law. But his perspective was limited, shaped by years of seeing people at their lowest, by the endless stream of cases that blurred into one another. And so he continued on, unaffected, a silent participant in a story he didn't even realize he was part of. Then one day, as fate would have it, one of Maya's cases found its way to Judge Albright's courtroom. It was a complicated case involving a young man accused of a crime that could impact his life for years to come. The evidence wasn't cut and dry, and the young man, barely out of his teens, had a story that spoke of hardship and resilience. Maya had spent weeks preparing for this case, determined to ensure that justice wasn't merely a formality, but something fair, something that truly served the man standing trial. As she entered the courtroom that day, a sense of purpose steadied her. But when she saw Judge Albright seated at the bench, she felt a rush of unease. Would he recognize her? Would he see her as the same woman he'd found just weeks before? And if he did, would it make any difference? She took her place, keeping her composure, determined not to let her personal experience cloud her professionalism. Yet, there was no denying that this case was personal. She wanted to make sure that Judge Albright saw her, truly saw her, not as a faceless prosecutor, but as someone who understood the weight of her decisions, someone who had seen both sides of the system. The hearing began with Judge Albright presiding over the proceedings in his usual controlled, precise manner. Maya presented her case, careful to lay out every detail with empathy and fairness. She spoke of the young man's circumstances, of the choices he'd made, and the life he led. Her words were measured, yet they carried a subtle plea. I hope that the judge would look beyond the charges and see the human being standing before him. Judge Albright listened, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on her as he weighed each point. But she couldn't tell if her message was reaching him or if he saw her any differently than he had before. When the day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was tense. Maya looked across at Judge Albright, wondering if he would approach this case as he had all the others, or if he would finally recognize the humanity she had tried to reveal to him. She felt her own pulse quicken as she spoke, outlining the defendant's background, his struggles, and the choices he had made in a world that had offered him few options. But she also felt a heavy silence coming from the bench, a silence that grew more oppressive with each word she spoke. Judge Albright watched her closely, his expression unreadable, and yet there was something different in his gaze, a flicker of understanding, maybe even doubt. As she laid out the case, her arguments unwavering yet compassionate, she could see his posture shift slightly, as though he too was grappling with the weight of the decision before him. But Maya wasn't the only one feeling the tension. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the man at the bench would look beyond the black and white of the law and see the human story that lay between those lines. As the trial continued, Maya found herself wondering how much of her own experience the judge had truly understood. Did he remember the woman he had once fined, the stranger he had almost dismissed without a second thought? She wasn't sure. She didn't know if he saw her as merely another prosecutor, or if he now realized the deeper connection they shared. But she knew that she couldn't let these thoughts cloud her focus. She was there to fight for justice, not for herself, but for the man whose future lay in her hands. And so she pressed on, bringing every piece of evidence, every testimony, forward with a clarity and conviction that left no room for doubt. At last it was the defense's turn to speak, and Maya sat down, her heart pounding as she awaited the judge's decision. She could see that Judge Albright was struggling, his expression torn between his duty to uphold the law and the possibility that the law itself might not be entirely fair. The defendant, standing quietly at the front of the room, watched the judge with a mixture of fear and hope, his fate hanging in the balance. Judge Albright cleared his throat, his voice steady yet slightly strained as he began to speak. He acknowledged the evidence, the facts, and the arguments, laying out the legal foundation of his decision with careful precision. But as he spoke, his words seemed to weigh heavily on him, as though each sentence carried the full burden of what this moment represented. He glanced at Maya, a hint of recognition flickering in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both traveled to this point. It was as if he understood, in that instant, the full impact of his choices, not just on the defendant, but on everyone who had stood before him over the years. Then, just as he was about to announce his ruling, he paused, his gaze shifting to the young man, whose fate he was about to seal. The room fell into a tense silence, everyone on edge, waiting to see if the judge would truly change, if he would rise above the boundaries of his role and embrace a deeper sense of justice. Maya held her breath, her own heart racing, as she silently urged him to take that step, to see beyond the rigid confines of the law and recognize the life of the person standing before him. Judge Albright's voice faltered, and he looked back at his notes, a shadow crossing his face as he grappled with his decision. It was as though, for the first time, he realized that the law was not always enough, that sometimes justice required empathy, understanding, and the willingness to break free from protocol. The courtroom remained hushed, every eye fixed on the man who held the power to shape the future of the person before him. The intensity in the room was palpable, the air thick with suspense. Maya could feel the weight of the moment, the tension building to a crescendo as everyone waited to see if the judge would take that leap, if he would allow himself to be guided not just by the letter of the law, but by the spirit of humanity. The outcome was uncertain, but in that instant, Maya knew that whatever happened, she had already changed the course of this story. She had brought the judge face to face with his own assumptions, his own biases, and forced him to confront the deeper, more difficult truths about justice. Judge Albright looked up, his gaze piercing as he addressed the courtroom. His words were measured, each one carrying a gravity that left the room silent, the suspense reaching a fever pitch. Maya's heart raced as she listened, knowing that the climax was near, that everything they had both worked toward was about to come to a head. The entire courtroom hung on his words, waiting, wondering if justice would finally be served in its truest form. But as he reached the final sentence, he paused once more, leaving everyone, especially Maya, in a state of agonizing anticipation, on the brink of discovering whether justice would be tempered with mercy, or whether the law would remain as unyielding as ever. Just as Judge Albright seemed ready to deliver his ruling, the courtroom doors swung open with a heavy creak, cutting through the tense silence. Heads turned as a man in a sharp, dark suit strode in, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He approached the judge's bench with quiet authority, his every move commanding attention. Maya recognized him instantly. Assistant U.S. Attorney Leonard Hayes, one of the highest-ranking prosecutors in the district. Her pulse quickened. Hayes' sudden arrival was unexpected, and in this particular case, highly unusual. She wondered what could have brought him here, and what it might mean for her client, for the case, and for the judge's looming decision. Judge Albright's brow furrowed as he watched Hayes approach, clearly taken off guard. Maya could see the conflict in his eyes, a mixture of irritation and unease. He looked at Hayes as if silently demanding an explanation, but Hayes only gave a brief nod, his expression unreadable. Without a word, the judge gestured for him to speak, and the room held its collective breath once again. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his tone measured, carefully restrained, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have some new evidence that has just come to light." He paused, glancing around the courtroom as if to assess his audience. "This evidence is crucial and directly impacts the case at hand." Maya's heart sank. She knew Hayes didn't step into cases like this unless something significant had shifted. Her mind raced through the possibilities, considering what new piece of information could change the trajectory of a case that had seemed, until now, to hinge on the judge's interpretation of the facts and her own careful arguments. The stakes, already high, seemed to skyrocket in that moment, as the entire courtroom waited to see what Hayes would reveal. Judge Albright's face was an unreadable mask as he processed Hayes' words. "Proceed, Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone sharp and wary, as if he, too, sensed that this new revelation would only complicate an already delicate situation. Hayes pulled out a slim folder from his briefcase and handed it to the court clerk, who quickly brought it to the judge's bench. "Inside are records and testimonies from witnesses who have come forward in recent days," Hayes continued. "These accounts provide a new perspective on the events surrounding the case and suggest that certain key details may have been overlooked." Maya felt a wave of frustration and disbelief. She had combed through every detail of her client's story, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, ensuring nothing had been missed. To suggest now, at this critical juncture, that there was something new, something that might challenge the defense she had so carefully built, was almost impossible to accept. The judge flipped through the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to genuine surprise. He looked up, meeting Maya's gaze for a brief, tense moment, and she could tell he was as unsettled by this twist as she was. Hayes had brought information that seemed to validate the prosecution's case, evidence that painted her client in a harsher light, one that could sway the judge toward a harsher ruling. Maya felt a chill run through her. Was this new evidence genuine, or was it something else? Something designed to influence the judge's decision, to shift the balance of justice at the very last minute. She knew she had to stay focused, to keep her composure, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every instinct told her that there was more to this development than met the eye, and that if she didn't act quickly, everything she had fought for could be swept away. As the judge continued reading, Hayes took a step back, his face a picture of calm professionalism, yet Maya couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind his composed exterior. Why had he waited until now to present this evidence? Why not bring it forward sooner? The timing was too perfect, too calculated, as though someone wanted to ensure Maya had no chance to respond, no opportunity to challenge or counter what Hayes had presented. The judge finally looked up, his expression grim as he addressed the courtroom. "In light of this new evidence," he began, "I am left with no choice but to delay my ruling until further investigation can be conducted. This court must ensure that all relevant facts are thoroughly examined before a final decision is made." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Maya's heart sank. The delay was a blow to her client, who had already been waiting anxiously for a resolution. But more than that, it meant that the narrative she had worked so hard to establish was now at risk of being overshadowed, twisted by this new information. As she packed up her files, her mind was racing, already forming a strategy to uncover the truth behind this unexpected turn. She couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was not simply acting as an impartial officer of the court, but was somehow entangled in a deeper game, one where the stakes went beyond her client's fate and touched on the very core of justice itself. Maya caught a glimpse of Hayes as he left the courtroom, and their eyes met for the briefest of moments. There was something in his expression, an unspoken warning, perhaps, or a silent challenge. Whatever it was, Maya knew that this battle was far from over. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was a clash not just over one case, but over principles, integrity, and the unspoken power dynamics that had surfaced between her, Judge Albright, and now Hayes. She left the courtroom that day with a renewed sense of determination. If Hayes thought he could sway this case with last-minute evidence, she would make it her mission to investigate, to scrutinize every detail, and uncover any inconsistencies. She knew that she couldn't afford to let this slide. Too much was at stake, not only for her client, but for every person who had ever faced a similar fight for justice. As she walked out of the courthouse, her thoughts swirling, Maya realized that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. Maya spent the following days buried in research, determined to understand the true nature of the so-called evidence that Hayes had brought to light. She combed through the testimonies, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined every detail with fresh eyes. Her instincts told her something was off, that this new evidence had been carefully orchestrated, but proving it would require both skill and a bit of luck. Finally, after nights spent poring over documents and analyzing records, she found her breakthrough. One of the witness testimonies that Hayes presented had a glaring discrepancy. It contradicted an earlier statement from the same witness, a fact hidden in the fine print of another case that hadn't been part of the initial review. Armed with this information, Maya returned to court, her heart pounding as she prepared to confront Hayes and bring the truth to light. The courtroom was tense, filled with people who sensed that today would be different. Even Judge Albright seemed more alert, his gaze flicking between Maya and Hayes with an intensity that suggested he was fully aware of the stakes. "Your Honor," Maya began, her voice steady but firm, "upon further investigation, I discovered inconsistencies in the testimonies presented by the prosecution." She outlined her findings with precision, pointing out how the witness had changed their story to support the new evidence, a detail that suggested manipulation. Hayes stiffened, his composure slipping just slightly as Maya presented her argument. "This evidence was entered in good faith," he said, his voice laced with a controlled defensiveness. "Any discrepancies are minor and do not affect the overall integrity of the case." But Maya wasn't finished. She went on to present additional details, emails, records, and an interview transcript that painted a picture of how Hayes had possibly coached the witness, pushing them to change their story in subtle but impactful ways. As she spoke, the tension in the courtroom thickened, the weight of her words settling heavily over everyone. Judge Albright's expression grew darker as Maya laid out her case. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this court takes any hint of impropriety very seriously. If the defense's claims are substantiated, this could be grounds for a mistrial." Hayes clenched his jaw, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an intensity that hinted at just how deeply he had been hoping to control the outcome. But Maya noticed something else, a flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he realized that his carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling. She had pushed him into a corner, and now, with everyone watching, he had no choice but to respond. And then, as if on cue, another twist unfolded. A quiet voice spoke up from the back of the courtroom. "I'd like to testify." Heads turned as a figure stood up. Someone Maya recognized, a clerk from the DA's office, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. She stepped forward, her gaze locked on Judge Albright as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, I have information that I believe is relevant to the integrity of this case," the clerk said. She glanced briefly at Hayes, who had gone pale, his jaw clenched in anger and disbelief. The clerk went on to reveal that she had been privy to discussions in the DA's office, where Hayes had openly suggested strengthening the case against Maya's client by coaching witnesses. Her testimony was simple but damning, exposing the pressure Hayes had exerted to sway the trial. Judge Albright's face was grim as he listened, his hands clenched tightly on the bench. When the clerk finished, He turned to Hayes, his voice steely. "Mr. Hayes, the court will not tolerate any actions that undermine the principles of justice. It appears that you have knowingly engaged in conduct unbecoming of your position." Realizing he was defeated, Hayes said nothing, his expression tight with anger. He left the courtroom, his career likely shattered, and as he walked out, Maya felt a wave of satisfaction tempered with relief. Her persistence had not only saved her client, but had exposed the corruption that could have cost an innocent man his future. With Hayes gone, Judge Albright turned to Maya, his gaze softened with something she hadn't seen before: respect. "Ms. Green," he said, "you've demonstrated a commitment to justice that goes beyond the confines of your role. This court acknowledges your tenacity and the integrity you brought to this case." He paused, giving her a small nod. "And I believe, in light of recent revelations, that this case should be dismissed." A murmur of surprise and relief swept through the courtroom as the judge's words sank in. Maya's client looked at her, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, and Maya gave him a reassuring smile. She had done what she'd set out to do, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the fairness of the system. As the proceedings concluded, Maya packed her things, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. But just as she was about to leave, Judge Albright called her back. "Ms. Green," he said quietly, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I hope you realize that your work here today hasn't just changed the outcome of this case. It's changed my perspective as well." Maya nodded, understanding that while she had won this battle, the war for justice was ongoing, and every victory mattered. She left the courtroom that day not just as a prosecutor, but as someone who had reshaped the very system she served. And as she walked out into the sunlight, she knew that this was just one of many battles she would face, and that, with every step forward, she would continue fighting to make a difference.